Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Royal Philatelic Society of Canada's Philately 101 series. This particular series is an introduction to philatelic research. We're really glad you're here this evening. I'd like to begin the meeting, if we could, with our land acknowledgement, which is something that we read at the beginning of each meeting. Like many other organizations in Canada, the Board of Directors of the Royal Philatelic Society of Canada has chosen to acknowledge Indigenous peoples in Canada with the following statement. As a step towards reconciliation, the RPSC acknowledges that our national office in Toronto stands on the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Our national office is also covered by Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaties. Furthermore, we acknowledge that Indigenous people did not give up the lands that they had been on for thousands of years that now constitute Canada. We also acknowledge that Europeans did not discover Canada or arrive on an uninhabited land. The RPSC acknowledges that Canada is covered by many treaties and modern lands, resources, and self-government agreements with Indigenous people, and that the provisions of many of these arrangements remain unfulfilled. The RPSC further acknowledges that many Indigenous peoples in Canada have not had their rights fully recognized and implemented according to the United National Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The RPSC pledges to promote recognition and knowledge of Indigenous peoples in Canada and elsewhere, and their cultures through philately. We will also work towards building positive relationships with Indigenous people in Canada. So welcome to our second Philately 101 series. I have a few announcements before we begin. So let's go ahead. I'd like to just remind you that the next two presenters, who are really the marquee presenters in this series, are going to be Harold Krish next Tuesday night. If you don't know Harold's superb work as a military historian, I encourage you to have a look at some of his recent book, and he's a remarkable researcher and a very engaging presenter. And Ron Fox, who is the creator of the Postal History Sundays blog that goes out each week. This is an exploration of mail generally that goes from North America to Europe, and the rates and routes and markings that involves. And he's also a lot of fun and a really, really super presenter. So I hope you'll join us for those too. I also wanted to do a small commercial for our first joint symposium on postal history, which the Postal History Society of Canada and the RPSC are sponsoring together. The times for this, it's on Saturday, November the 9th, and the time is 12 to 5 or 5:30, depending on how many questions there are at the end of our last sessions. It's open to everyone. There's no charge for it. You can find further information, including login information, on the RPSC's website, which is rpsc.org. So tonight we're going to have an introduction to philatelic research. This is not going to be quite as deep a dive as I know that Harold and Ron will do over the next couple of weeks. I wanted to approach this from the standpoint of how philatelic research can guide us to honing our discoveries on a particular topic. So here's just a little bit about me. You can certainly read that, and most of you probably are aware of some of these things. My specialties are Belgian stamps, especially the issues 1919 and 1921, one of which we're going to be speaking about tonight. Belgian railway stamps and documents, and I'm just remarkably passionate about European auxiliary markings and labels. So I'd like to suggest, if you're not engaging in a lot of philatelic research, I would like to say to you, first of all, don't be afraid. There's there's so many possibilities for conducting research right from your home. The American Philatelic Society allows members and non-members to register for their digital library and their digital connection to the remarkable philatelic union that has taken place. It's a great place to start. I also want to encourage you to look at websites that are hosted by countries or subject areas that you may be interested in researching. A lot of organizations allow, will only put the first year or two of their journal behind a paywall, and then all the other editions are available for anyone to peruse. So it's a really good way to start. So first of all, don't be scared about this topic. I love this. Rabbit holes all lead somewhere. They may not, as you will see in this presentation tonight, lead us where we think we're going, but they lead us somewhere. And the second point is rabbit holes are connected to other rabbit holes. So I've done many deep dives looking for a specific angle on a specific topic, and what I've ended up with is something totally different. But my initial journey down the rabbit hole has led me to another course, which has led me to what I finally want to or end up discovering. So don't be afraid if you find yourself kind of wandering on your research to begin with. So the origins of this study tonight come from the fact that I am very passionate about the Belgian stamps that follow World War I. Now you say to yourself, why these specific stamps? Well, first of all, they're some of the most interesting and storied topics in Belgian philately. But also because I love philately at times of change, at times of reinvention. And of course, the time right after World War I is tragic, but also fascinating in terms of Belgium because they had suffered terribly under the German occupation. And most of their infrastructure had been destroyed. And so a lot of the decisions that happen with the stamps you see on the cover, or on this sheet here, this page, had to be made for reasons other than just presenting beautiful stamps. Well, I had researched all of the stamps that you see in front of you and a couple of the other ones, but there was one that I had completely ignored. Yes, it's this one. I used to have a member of my choir who used to say a lay sigh all the time as a way of giving some dignity to frustration. This stamp is probably one of the least attractive stamps that Belgium has ever released. Not that the actual vignette and the stamp itself is unattractive, because it's from a very storied issue, which we will talk about in a little bit. But it's a really unattractive color. It's very dull. There's nothing particularly appealing about it. And so I just kind of ignored it until there was nothing left to look at. So what do you do with something that's as uninspiring as this? If you know the Paul McCartney and Wings song, "We're so sorry, Uncle Albert, but we haven't heard a thing all day. We're so sorry, Uncle Albert, but if anything should happen, we'll be sure to give you a ring." This is the King Albert I 1915 issue of Belgium. The problem is this stamp was released quite a few years, 5 years plus after the original series. And we'll see in a few minutes that it was an afterthought. And so what do you do with something that even philatelic researchers and scholars agree is a very insignificant stamp? And this is why I was so attracted to the topic. I love working on things that people think are not interesting and have no value. So route one, Let's take a look at the stamp. Seems like a good place to begin. Surely there's got to be something interesting about this stamp. So how did I begin? Well, as most of us do, I began with the catalog. Let me suggest that when you're researching, the Scott catalog is an excellent catalog. But when you start looking for countries outside of the U.S., there usually is a country-specific catalog that will give you a lot more information, specific information. Scott can't tell you everything about, foreign stamps. It doesn't go into the deep dive that it does for U.S. stamps. So try to find out what the catalog is that is the Scott of your particular country. In the case of this, it's the catalog known as COB, the Catalogue Officiel de Belge. So I started there. Here's what I found. Go to the catalog. Number 1. Take a look. There's not a lot there. We know that it was released on the December 30th, 1920. A very odd time, by the way, a very odd day to release a stamp right before two holidays. We know that it was perforated 14. We can tell that it was printed by typography. We can tell that it's an indeterminate number were produced. We know from the upper lettering above that it's part of the 1915 type of King Albert stamps. And look, down below, there are a couple of varieties. I don't really know how one is going to make an article out of this. So what did I do? Well, I went to another catalog. I went to an older catalog that contains more information. You may not be familiar with the name Willy Bellas, but he was the great-grandfather of Belgian philately, probably third or fourth in line after the original guys in the late 1890s, 1900s. And his catalogs are remarkable for their detail. So I happen to have a copy of the 1940 catalog, so I had a look at it. And here's what I found. Well, now I know that at the top that this stamp was approved by the ministry on the 15th of December. That's very interesting. And that the center portion, the king's image, comes from the 1915 series. I kind of knew that already anyway. But I've learned something a little bit more. There are 3 different colors. At least as far as Bellas is considered, there are 3 different colors of stamp printing: a gray, a lighter gray, and black gray. Well, that's not very interesting, really. A few little details on the bottom that we've already talked about. Okay, so I've looked at the 2 big catalogs. So now what do? Well, I might as well start searching. So I go, of course, as all Canadian philatelists do, to the VGG, the Vincent Graves Green, to the Harry Sutherland Philatelic Library, and I enter the terms King Albert 1920 issue. And I come up with absolutely nothing. There's nothing in their library that can help me at all. Next step. Well, I go to the Robert Mason Digital Library in the at the APS, the American Philatelic Research Library, and I type in 1920 Cobb number 183, which is the number that this is given in the catalog. And I come up with 2 things, and I'm excited because McKeel's Weekly Stamp News had some pretty decent articles in it in the day. And what I discover is it's just ads for these 2 new stamps that have been released. And so there's nothing there. So now I've hit between a rock and a hard place, nothing really in the catalogs. I can't find anything digitally. So now I start looking at the study circles, study groups, philatelic associations that have to do with this topic. And in my case, the Belgian Philatelic Study Circle, even though it's somewhat dormant right now, is really the place to go. The Belgian Academy we'll talk about in a minute, but that's French and Dutch speaking or Flemish. But the Belgian Philatelic Study Circles in the UK, they have a long history. Surely they have to have something about this stamp. Type in COB 183 and bingo. The first thing listed is an article by Reg Harrison, who was the president of the Belgian Philatelic Study Circle. And I click on that, and what do I find? Not much. I find some background that I already know. I find a little bit about why the stamp was created. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but it's generally just an outline. Maybe I have a little bit more information, but not much more. So I go next to the Belgian National Archives. Now, I don't know what your experience is if you research Canada. I have found the people at the National Library and Archives to be very, very helpful whenever I've gone to them. And I find the same thing with the Belgian National Archive. If I send a question and find the correct person, they will go to extremes to help and try to answer my question. So I gave them all the information I could on this, asked if there was anything in terms of ministerial decrees or any of the information on the production of the stamp, and I waited with bated breath. Surely they've got to have something. Well, it turns out that most of the information from that period was destroyed during the Second World War, when the archives were bombed during the war. And there are sporadic things that were saved, but there's absolutely nothing on my stamp at all. So this isn't even going to help me. Now I take a deep breath and I go to the Belgian Academy, which is the highest standing organization in terms of Belgian philately that one can go to. You have to be elected to be a member of this group, and it's made up of experts from across the world who deal with this stuff. I write to them. What do I get? Not much. They suggest to me, why don't you go back and look at the COB catalog, the Catalogue Officiel de Belge, and see what it says about the other stamps in the 1915 issue. And I had done that, but I hadn't really connected the dots. But what I learned from Reg Harrison's brief article from the Belgian Philatelic Study Circle was that it had been printed from plate 2, from type 2, the same plate that was used to print the 1, 2, 5, and 15 cent, or a portion of the original stamps in 1915. So I went back and I had a look at those. What I discovered was that there was a consistency about the stamps that were published in 1920 for the 3 centime issue that we're looking at. There was a consistency because they had been printed from the same plates. So now I could go back and have a look at the articles on the 1 cent, 2 cent, 5 cent, and 15 cent King Albert I issues and learn some things about the stamp and how, and the challenges in printing it, and the number of stamps that were printed, and all of the little idiosyncrasies of that plate. So that was really helpful. So I found out from the Belgian Academy that, again, it was printed from the type 2 plate. So now I had an amazing connection because there is a catalog produced by Levesque that shows all of the variations in the plate that printed the type 2 plate, including the variations for COB 183, the one we're talking about. So now I had the chance to basically go through that catalog and start looking at my stamps and finding all of the individual things that that were variations. And I have to say, the plate was really in bad shape by the time they printed this 3-cent stamp, but nothing was done with it because they had to produce it very quickly. We don't know this yet, but we're about to find out. So one of the things that makes this issue so fascinating to look at is almost every stamp in the 100-page sheet has some kind of identifiable variation on it. As you will see, I think later on, there are the plate, the external lines around the plate, the frame lines, were in such bad shape by the time they printed the 3 centime stamp. They began to degrade really quickly. So the Levesque catalog gives me all of that information, but it's also a dead end because I wanted to do some original work on this, and what I discovered was Levesque had already done it. So really, any article that I was going to write about this stamp basically had already been covered. I was able, however, to reconstruct the plate using both the Type 2 plate, using both Levesque's catalog and also full sheets of the plate that I had. And I found that really interesting because every one of those stamps is different, and it was a really great exercise and very enjoyable, but nothing I could turn into an article. Okay, so was there anything new in what I found? Well, I discovered that the heavy black lines around the outside of this 1920 King Albert 3 centime stamp had been the first issue of Belgian stamps that had what was called Jubilee lines, which some of you will be familiar from UK stamps. The Jubilee lines are put around the outside of a plate. They're raised metal that prevents the outside edge of the plate from degrading and the stamps from becoming, the frame lines from becoming even more worn than they were. Well, that sounded like a really interesting thing, but not particularly useful for writing an article. So now I'm at a dead end. So now I'm going to go on to route number 2, which is the historical aspect of this. I can't really write anything about the stamp itself. It has been largely ignored by serious philatelists, but Levesque did most of the work on the variations and varieties, so not much I could do with that. So now let's go on to the historical, which is route 2 for me, always. Who was King Albert? Well, Albert I was the king of the Belgians from 1909 until 1934. The death of the only son of King Leopold II. Leopold II was the absolutely horrible king of Belgium who took the Belgian Congo as his personal possession, and the atrocities that followed there were just horrendous. When Leopold II died, Albert's older brother had already died, and this placed Albert in direct line to the Belgian throne. Albert's father was Philip, who was the Count of Flanders and the brother of Leopold I, the first king. Albert was very well educated, especially in science. He was extremely tall, wore thick glasses, and had a shy personality. He studied naval construction and engineering in England. Okay, these are interesting things, but they've been reported before, nothing too exciting yet. Before World War I, Albert was concerned with the size of Belgium's army, which had an approved defensive force of just 350,000. As such, prior to World War I, he had Belgium declare neutrality so that they would not be put in a situation where they would have to fight the larger German army. But tensions continued to escalate, and Albert wrote a letter to the German emperor reminding him of Belgium's neutrality on July the 31st, 1914. But on August the 2nd, 1914, a German ultimatum came through demanding free passage through Belgium. The German High Command demanded free passage through the city of Liège and to be able to attack France from the north. And Albert gave the very famous reply to the German emperor I govern a nation, not a road, the answer is no. And the German army unleashed attack on the city of Liège. The Belgians historically defended it, slowed the Germans down for 10 days, and gave the French a chance to establish a defensive line. Otherwise, the country would have been overrun, and in exchange, the Belgians were punished very aggressively by the Germans for that happening. So here's just a small graph of the German attack down into France. So to prevent anything, now this I found really interesting, to prevent anything that might be of use to the invading Germans from falling into their hands, respective of the Department of State, they, including the postal authority, so anything that they could use, the government asked the people that worked in these departments to destroy everything that they could. Here, they're destroying a turntable, so the Germans couldn't use that. But they destroyed as much of the postal cancelers, equipment, anything that the Germans could have taken and adopted. It was due to the ability, his military ability, that Albert's reputation in the international front was very high. Indeed, throughout the war, if you look up here, if you can see my cursor on the left-hand upper corner, this little corner of Belgium was never occupied by the Germans and remained free. And so that's where Albert spent most of the war. And throughout World War I, Albert remained in that dangerous area and often visited the trenches. As you can see, he was very tall. It was because he was present to his troops and his people that he became such a legendary leader. And on October 1918, he took charge of the general offensive, and his forces retook Ostend and Bruges. So you can see, as we're going through this, that this is a very important figure. This is a very an inspirational leader who kept his people believing that they would eventually be free. After the armistice, the king and queen and their family made a triumphal entry into Brussels on November 22nd, 1918, and you can understand why he was held in such high social regard, because his first speech from the throne introduced universal suffrage, effective equality of the two national languages, French and Flemish or Dutch, as you wish, which had not been the case. French was always privileged. The switch at the Flemish University of Ghent to allow them to teach in Flemish, recognition of trade unions, and the extension of vast social legislation to care for people who had suffered during the war. That's all we have. There's nothing else on our beloved King Albert that will help us. Dead end number 2. So let's go to route number 3, postal history. You can see, I mean, we've already been down 2 rabbit holes. We've learned some things. Those things are going to come and help us shortly. But now we've got to go in a different direction, postal history. Well, what now? One interesting unnoticed bit of information that I found in the Willy Ballas catalog was that the 3 centime stamp that we're talking about was the first stamp to be issued by Belgium, which seemed remarkable to me that they'd never had a 3 centime stamp. They obviously never had a need for it. So I wondered, what was the need? So this stamp was issued because of an increase in the imprimae rate. And you can think of the imprimae rate as the printed matter rate for Belgium. It includes commercial mail, printed mail, postal wrappers, postcards with 5 or fewer words on them. And to this day, by the way, if you mail, you can mail in Europe a card at the printed matter rate if you put 5 or fewer words. not counting the address, but in the message section. And of course, also calling cards, because people would send calling cards in the mail. So that's what the stamp was needed for. So how did they get there? Well, following the secession of World War I, the Belgian government lowered the printed matter rate from 5 cents, 5 centimes, which had been imposed by the German occupational government at the beginning of 1918. They lowered it to 1 centime, which is what it was at the beginning of the war. This was done almost immediately, just 4 days after the armistice. The German rate had been considered punitive, so the decision to lower the rate to 1 centime was clearly designed as a show of good faith on the part of the Belgian Postal Authority. And I'm sure that their attitude was that they wanted business to be able to begin as much as was possible to return to normal. And so they wanted to make sure that businesses were able to mail their information and get their publications out. On the right-hand side over here, you'll see the 1 centime stamp. This is an example of the imprimé rate on a postal card that was had 5 or fewer words on it, so it could go at the printed matter rate. That's the 1 centime King Albert stamp, which came from 1915. So why did the rate change? Well, because of the pressures exerted, as we saw, the devastation created on public sector materials, because of the pressures exerted on the Belgian Postal Authority by the need to rebuild the service in the period immediately following World War I, this rate had to be raised to 2 centimes just slightly over a year later. And again, here's an example of the 2 centime King Albert stamp. This is a postcard with 5 or fewer words on the left-hand side, so it goes at the imprimé rate. What was the reason that these King Albert stamps had been released? Well, first of all, they had been released because the stamps that were in play when the Germans invaded, the Belgian government in exile was afraid that the Germans would get their hands on those stamps. They would counterfeit them or misuse them. So they demonetized those stamps almost immediately so that they had no value and released this series of stamps on the part of the Belgian government in exile. And the choice to use Albert's vignette in the center of these was one of the ways to remind people that their king was still with them and hadn't left the country. So a final increase took place on January the 1st, 1921. Now remember, our stamp was released on December the 30th, 1920, and the rate was increased to 3 centimes. This was not positively received by the public. They were very angry about the fact that the rate had tripled in slightly over 2 years. And so there was a great deal of displeasure, and it's very interesting because the stamps around this period on a lot of the imprimé rate are very often put upside down so that Albert's facing down, which was a way of illustrating your displeasure with the monarchy over the choice that they had made, or the government. So here you see the problem. Now they've got a 1 and 2 centime stamp, but they don't have a 3 centime stamp for the new rate. We've already talked about this, so you can just see the devastation. It's really very hard to imagine. My grandfather was in Belgium in the First World War and talked about very movingly about how there was virtually nothing left in large cities. It's an example on the right. So now we get to the point of the 3 centime stamp. First of all, there had never been a need for a 3 centime rate in Belgium before this time. Never. This issue needed to be produced really quickly because the decision to raise the rate was made rather spectacularly quickly. They realized they were losing money on the printed matter things, and it was costing the postal authority a lot of money. And so they made the decision quickly to increase the rate. So they had to come up with a way to produce a 3 centime stamp rapidly, which pretty much put out of any possibility they were going to produce a new stamp. So which stamp to use? I believe the decision to use this same stamp was a way of reminding them that the king had been with us through the war, that we had come through the other side, and hard times were still here, but our king was still here to guide us. And I believe that's why the 3 centime stamp uses the effigy of Albert I. The problem was, as we said, and you only need to look at the frame lines around these 4 stamps to see what condition that Type 2 plate was in. It was questionable from the very beginning, and so it was necessary for them to print a lot of these stamps, and the plates began to degrade rapidly. Hence the Jubilee lines, which were added before. So what things could, I discovered what things could be sent with this 3 centime stamp. Well, if you take a look here, here's a postal wrapper that would have contained printed matter. These are the hardest things to find because you rip off the covers off your magazines or your newspapers when they come. There's no reason to save the wrapper. So postal wrappers. I also discovered that a lot of these postal wrappers and pieces of mail were canceled with these very bizarre looking canceling devices on the top. And this led me down a kind of ancillary rabbit hole, which basically said to me, what are these about? And what I discovered was that these were used in places where there was no canceling device left that could be used appropriately. There was no desire to use the German cancelers. Although some cities did use them, they just defaced the German portions of the stamps and ground them out. But this is called a fortune cancel because it's a cancel, it's called a fork cancel. It's what they had in Brussels at the time that this was printed. So what do I know about this? Well, I researched fortune cancels, and I discovered that even in major cities, there was almost nothing to cancel with. So for the first month or two, people had to use what they could. So this is probably a January or early February 2021 cancel. Large cities like Brussels and Antwerp and Ghent and Charleroi got their cancelers first. So this is a very early cancel. Here's an interesting, beautiful cover. Again, it's within period. Fascinating because by 1922, February of 1922, they had restored the cancelers to the point that they also had what's called a flam, that advertising bit on the right-hand side. This particular one advertises the packet boat service that went back and forth sometimes twice a day between England and Belgium. Here's a postcard with 5 or fewer words on it with some fascinating auxiliary markings and labels. We don't really know. This tells us that the person on this card was unknown and the card was returned to sender. But we're not 100% sure whether that was the issue or whether the city was wrong. The small circles are postman's marks, so we know they tried to deliver this 5 times and weren't able to. Here's another fortune cancel for this. So this again is probably very early in 1921. Ghent would have gotten theirs right after Antwerp and Brussels. Now this is something that I didn't know, and I did a presentation on this stamp for the Royal Philatelic Society of London recently, and a fascinating man from Belgium told me that this is actually a very rare cancel. This would have been picked up at a very small post box in a city where there was no post office. And the postman walked from local post box to local post box. And in order to make sure that the cancel, that they could prove that they had picked up the mail, they had to take the cancel and stamp a timesheet in this particular cancel for this particular mailbox. Stamp a timesheet inside the box so that when the inspector came, it would show that they had been there. He clearly noticed that this hadn't been canceled, and so he canceled the stamp with the same kind of proof of pickup that he would have used on the sheet. Fascinating. Now here's a postcard with more than 5 words on it. So I've run into a lot of these, and it was taxed at what would have been the letter or the full postcard rate, and so in order to get it there, it was hit with a 15 centime rate. This is probably the cruelest enforcement of this that I have encountered. Postcards with 5 words or fewer, and 5 words means 5 words. This is what was called a blind assist card. It's not Braille, but it's designed to be read by someone who's unsighted. And to think that they were so dogmatic about their approach to this that they actually hit this card with a 35 centime tax is remarkable. Okay, so at the end, everybody was upset with Cobb 183. Nobody liked the stamp. It's probably the most hated stamp in the first 50 years of the 20th century in Belgium. It was ugly. It was utilitarian. And so it was almost immediately replaced by the stamp on the right, which became the workhorse of the impriме rate through, the early mid-1930s. And so that's everything we were able to find out about that particular bit of postal knowledge. It remained in service. The stamp, the Cobb 183 remained in service. So then my goal became to try to find after period service pieces that were interesting. And this is the largest known usage of this. And what's interesting about it is you'll recognize at the top here, this is the picture that we started our discussion of King Albert with. It's a very famous photo taken during the war, and it was the first stamp released to the nation after the war. These are the King Albert stamps with Red Cross markings on them. Here are the other Albert stamps that were released during the war. So what's really interesting is that this contains most of the definitive stamps that would have been released during the war or right after it. And amazingly, it's only overfranked by 1 cent. So our next exit is our 4th one, but this is not a detour. This is not an exit, it's a detour. A really burgeoning corner of especially exhibiting, but also of philatelic writing, is social philately. Looking at the people that mail was mailed to, or from whom it was mailed. And so I'm not going to do a lot with this. I just wanted to point this out as a 4th route that you can take. Renee Stevens, who this is, was sent from an exposition of his work, was an impressionist and modern artist who was born in 1858 and was quite an important fellow. So it would be possible to do, I have 3 of these, it would be possible to do a nice little article on Renee Stevens if that was our thing and something we wanted to do. Of course, there are also things like earliest known use. This is actually a remarkable cover. This is the first day of use, which would have been December 30th, 1920. And I bought this cover. I know it's philatelic. You can tell it's philatelic. It was written by mailed by the Ghent Society for Stamp Collecting. But I liked it because it's the only cover I've ever seen that was a first day cover. And as we said, the thing that's odd about this is the first day cover is a very strange concept because it was released around noon on December the 30th, right before New Year's Eve, which is a holiday, and New Year's Day, which was a holiday. So they wanted to have it ready on the 2nd of January when it went, which is why it's so impossible to find any first day covers for this. But doing some research, I discovered that this was sent from the Ghent Society of Stamp Collecting to the Baron de Coos, who was the president of the society at the time. So most likely he mailed it to himself. But what I discovered when I did a little bit more research was that the Baron was one of Belgium's greatest philatelists. And this is why I feel it's really important to look at your covers for more than just information on rates, routes, and markings, because that, to me, makes this a really fascinating piece. So the upshot of all of this is a very insignificant stamp that served really only for 2 years. It was replaced almost immediately. It was hated by the public. It was poorly realized in a really ugly color. My friends who collect the first 1915 issue said, "Oh, no, you're wrong. People write about this stamp as part of the issue." But nobody really has ever done a deep dive into this standalone stamp right after World War I. They just tell you the things we found at the very beginning. So I learned a tremendous amount about this stamp by following these divergent pathways and rabbit holes. So here's what I learned from this project. Nothing is insignificant. You may think it is, but I heard Cheryl Gans say one time that when she's looking for a new project to write about, the first thing she does, first or second thing she does, is to search and see if a lot of work has been done on this stamp or this cover or this subject. Because if it has, probably there's not much else that I can bring to it. So nothing is insignificant, as you can see from this very, very boring stamp. Number 2, don't give up. Things don't always progress in a straight line. It wasn't until I realized that this stamp had been released for a rate increase, which was explained why there had never been a 3 centime stamp before, and explained the socio-political and economic response to that rate increase, that I realized why people hated this stamp so much. It represented what they thought was a return to punitive rates. What appears to be a dead end can lead to understanding. I always try to approach my research by following the 4 paths that I did today. Follow the stamp, the history around the stamp, the rates, routes, markings of the stamp, and then last of all, anything I can find out in terms of social philately. And isolated bits of random information can lead to insights down the road, as was the case when I realized that this stamp had been necessitated by a very obscure rate increase. So all of this to say, don't give up. Never be afraid to follow that rabbit hole. Who knows where it will lead you, and most likely you will eventually come up with something that others haven't discovered. And I guess I would like to say, not in a boastful way, but just in a proud way, that the exhibit that I did on the stamp actually won the Best in Show for one frame exhibit at the Edmonton Stamp Show a year or two ago, which amazed me as much as I think it did the judges. People are fascinated by detailed studies of insignificance that lead to greater understanding of the whole picture. So I don't know if there are any questions. I don't see any. Please feel free to put them in if you have any. The main thing is what I wanted to do with this talk today was kind of open the door to approaches that you can take and techniques that you can follow to research your stamps. I know next week that Harold and the following week that Rob will go into greater detail on this, but I thought it was a good opening for this. All right. One last thing, if there's anything that you would like to see us do in this series going forward, please do let us know. We'd like to do 3 of these a year, and so I hope that in February or so we might have another one. So if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, we'd be absolutely delighted to do that. And I hope that you will find this meaningful. If you're watching this after the fact online, I hope that you enjoy it as well. So remember, next week, Harold Krish, a military historian, among many other things, will be our featured speaker. So please use the same Zoom link. It can be used for all 3 discussions. So same one for the next 2 weeks. And I'll look forward to seeing you all at that. And thank you very much for visiting with us today and for spending your time listening. And I wish you a good night, and thank you very much, as always, for your support of the RPSC, and we look forward to seeing you soon.